The flatbed arrived on a Wednesday, which was already the wrong kind of day. Callum had been on the phone with the parts supplier in Sudbury when he heard the air brakes hiss outside, and he stepped out into the gray November light, still holding the receiver, still half listening to a man explaining why a carburetor kit wouldn't ship until after Christmas. He set the phone down on the window ledge without saying goodbye. There was a truck idling at the edge of his lot, and on its bed, covered loosely in a tarp that had come half undone on the highway, were 4 machines he had never expected to see outside of a manufacturer's catalog. He walked over slowly. Not because he wasn't curious. He was. But because his daughter Petra was watching from the window of the office, nose pressed to the glass the way she did whenever something interesting arrived, and he didn't want her to see him run. The driver climbed down and handed him a clipboard. "You Drummond?" "I am," said Callum Drummond. "Sign here. Eyes only delivery, no manifest." Callum looked at the tarp. One corner had blown back to reveal a corner of cast iron unmistakable in its proportions. He signed the clipboard and handed it back without looking at the man. By the time he heard the truck drive away, he was already pulling back the tarp. They were turbocharged inline-6 blocks. 4 of them, late-model experimental units, the kind that had been in prototype testing for a racing development program he'd spent 3 years consulting on before everything went sideways. Before Catherine died. Before he came back to Timmins and opened the garage and started trying to figure out who he was without the career that had defined him. There was a note tucked under the edge of the nearest block. It was on company letterhead from Ashworth Dynamics, which told him everything and nothing at once, and it was signed by a woman named Beverly Crane. "These have been written off. They are no longer our property. Do with them what you will. BC." He read it twice. He turned it over. Nothing on the back. Petra appeared at his elbow. Rubber boots 2 sizes too big, her braids coming undone on the left side the way they always did by midday, because she insisted on doing them herself. "Are those engines?" she said. "They are," Callum said. "Are they ours?" He folded the note and put it in his chest pocket. Apparently. He didn't sleep well that night. He lay in the dark of the house that had been too quiet for 2 years now and thought about Beverly Crane, whom he had never met but knew by reputation, the way everyone in the Canadian automotive industry knew her, as the founder and majority shareholder of Ashworth Dynamics, a woman who had taken a mid-sized parts manufacturer in Brantford and turned it into a billion-dollar advanced propulsion company over 20 years. She was 62. She gave money to hospitals. She had fired 3 CEOs before finally running the company herself. She was not, by any account he had ever heard, the kind of person who threw things away carelessly, which meant the engines weren't carelessly thrown away, which meant something had happened to them or to the program they came from that made her want them gone quickly and quietly. He got up at 5 and went to the garage and turned on every light. Up close, in proper fluorescent brightness, he could see it. The blocks were scored along the lower cylinder walls. One had a cracked oil gallery. Another had what looked like heat damage around the head gasket surface. Not from overheating, from something more specific, more deliberate. Someone had run these engines wrong. Not negligently wrong, strategically wrong. The kind of wrong that takes engineering knowledge to execute. He stood in the cold of the garage with his coffee going cold in his hand and felt a thing he hadn't felt in a long time. Not anger, not grief. Something older and quieter than either. He felt like an engineer again. The town of Timmins had 17,000 people and 3 traffic lights and a Tim Hortons on every second block, and it had never once asked Callum Drummond to explain himself, which was one of the reasons he'd come back. His parents had retired to Kelowna. His sister was in Halifax. There was nothing pulling him here except the fact that he had grown up here, and grown up here meant something when everything else had come apart. He'd opened Drummond Automotive 2 years ago in a building on Algonquin Boulevard that used to be a transmission shop. He had 2 bays, a hydraulic lift that he'd rebuilt from a salvage unit himself, and a reputation for being the only mechanic in the region who would work on European imports without charging an import shop rate. He was not getting rich. He was keeping the lights on and keeping Petra fed and making sure she got to school on time most mornings, which was the full scope of his current ambition. Petra was 7. She had her mother's eyes and her own opinions about everything, delivered with a seriousness that made adults blink. She spent her after-school hours on a stool in the corner of the garage doing homework, And when she finished her homework, she watched Callum work, and occasionally she handed him tools. And this was, he thought, not a bad way to spend a childhood, though he worried about it anyway. The way fathers worry about everything. He told Nadia, who ran the bookkeeping for 3 businesses on his block, about the engines. Nadia was 60 and had been doing books since before he was born, and she received most information with the same neutral expression. Ashworth Dynamics, she said. That's the Crane woman. Yes. Why would she send you engines? I don't know yet. Are you going to find out? Eventually, he said. Nadia looked at him over her reading glasses. You're going to fix them first and ask questions later. I'm going to assess them first, he said, which is different. It wasn't different. He knew it wasn't different. He was already buying parts. He had one employee, a young man named Vic Hazelton, who was 19 and mechanically gifted and deeply uninterested in any conversation that didn't involve engines or hockey. Vic had dropped out of the trades program at Northern College after 1 semester, not because he couldn't do the work, but because the instruction moved too slowly for him. Callum had taken him on as an apprentice 6 months ago, on the recommendation of a teacher who'd said, simply, he'll frustrate you and he'll be worth it. Both had proven accurate. Vic looked at the 4 blocks on the second morning with the same expression he used for everything. Calm, evaluative, slightly impatient. Then he said, those are the Ashworth M9 units. Callum set down his coffee. How do you know that? I follow the motorsport development feeds. These were in prototype testing for the GT Endurance program, right? I thought the program got canceled. It did. Vic crouched and looked at the scoring on the cylinder walls of the first block. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then, someone didn't want this to work. That's what I think. Why? Callum said. That's the question. He didn't expect the phone call. It came on a Saturday morning while he was at the kitchen table, helping Petra with a worksheet about weather systems, and the number had a 905 area code which she didn't recognize. He almost didn't answer. Mr. Drummond. A woman's voice. Controlled. Not unfamiliar with being the one who called. Speaking. My name is Beverly Crane. I believe you received a delivery last week. He was quiet for a moment. Petra looked up from her worksheet and he made a gesture she understood. 1 finger, 1 minute, and she went back to drawing a diagram of a cumulus cloud. I did, he said. I've been wondering when you'd call. I've been deciding whether I should. A pause. I sent those engines to you specifically, Mr. Drummond, not to a scrapyard, not to a competitor. I read your consulting report on the M9 combustion dynamics from 3 years ago. You're the only person outside my own engineering team who understood what those blocks were designed to do. What happened to your engineering team? Another pause, longer. 2 of them are gone. 1 resigned. 1 was let go under circumstances I'm still investigating. The 3rd is someone I don't trust, which means I don't trust the investigation either. Callum looked at Petra, who was drawing clouds with total concentration, her tongue between her teeth. Why send them to me? He said. If you wanted them assessed. I didn't want them assessed, Beverly said. I wanted them somewhere safe, and somewhere they might actually be fixed. Those are 2 things your garage is apparently capable of providing. You've been looking into me. Of course I have. He thought about Catherine, who had also been someone who did her research before trusting anyone. He thought about how that wasn't a bad quality in a person. All right, he said. I'll call you when I know more. It took him 6 weeks to fully assess all 4 blocks. He worked evenings and early mornings, before Petra woke and after she went to bed, in the cold of the garage with the propane heater going, and old hockey on the radio. He cataloged the damage in a binder he kept in the locked drawer of his desk. Damage that was, as he'd suspected from the beginning, not random and not accidental. Someone had introduced particulate contamination into the oil systems during testing. Someone had modified the ignition timing data submitted to the engineers after the prototype runs, so that the engineers saw numbers that made the blocks look like failures when the actual failure was manufactured. It was careful. It was sophisticated. It required someone with access to the testing facility and knowledge of the systems, and it required them to be motivated by something more personal than money. The blocks themselves, stripped of the fraudulent data and the contamination, were extraordinary. He rebuilt the first one on a Sunday afternoon with Petra sitting on her stool, eating an apple, and asking him questions he answered as honestly as he could. When he turned it over for the first time on a bench test, The sound it made was something close to musical. "It works," Petra said, stating a fact. "It works," Callum agreed. She considered this. "Did someone try to make it not work?" "Yeah," he said. "Someone did. That's a mean thing to do." "It is." She ate the last of her apple and set the core neatly on the edge of the workbench. "Are you going to find out who?" He turned off the bench test and the garage went quiet. "That's not really my job," he said. "But you want to," she said. He looked at her for a moment. 7 years old and absolutely no tolerance for anything less than the truth. "Yeah," he said. "I do." The name came to him through an unexpected source. There was a man named Bartholomew Inch who had a cabinet-making shop 2 blocks from Callum's garage, and Bartholomew Inch was the kind of man who knew everything about everyone in every industry he'd ever adjacent to, which was many industries, because Bartholomew was 64 and had lived an eventful life. He and Callum had developed a friendship over shared lunch hours, and when Callum mentioned carefully that he was curious about the Ashworth GT program and who might have had motive to see it fail, Bartholomew didn't even look up from his sandwich. "Gideon Pruitt," he said. Callum waited. He was the Ashworth VP of Product Development from 2019 to 2023. He had a handshake deal, not a written contract, a handshake deal with the Valorian Group in Stuttgart to sell them an exclusive license on the M9 block design if the endurance program underperformed. If the program succeeded, the deal was off. The crane woman didn't know about it. Nobody at Ashworth knew about it officially, but the whisper went around. "Where did you hear this?" Bartholomew shrugged. "My brother-in-law does millwork for the Valorian Canadian office. He hears things." Callum went home that night and sat at the kitchen table for a long time before calling Beverly Crane. She answered on the second ring. He laid out what he knew, not as an accusation, not as a conclusion, but as a sequence of facts arranged in the order he'd found them, the way his consulting reports used to read, precise and unsentimental. When he finished, there was silence on the line for a while. "Gideon Pruitt," she said finally. Her voice hadn't changed much, but something beneath it had. "I can't prove it," Callum said. "I can tell you what the engine showed me. The rest is yours to investigate." "I know," she said. "I have investigators. I've been using the wrong question." Another pause. "You fixed them. All 4. 3 fully. The 4th is at about 80%. It needs a part that's no longer in production, but I've got a machinist in Sault Ste. Marie I think can fabricate it." "What are they worth?" Beverly said. "The 4 of them, if they're performing at specification." He'd run the numbers, partly out of habit, and partly because he couldn't help it. Racing-grade prototype blocks from a canceled development program, fully restored, documentation of their original performance data, clear provenance, and the story attached to them. The story especially, because stories add value in motorsport the way they add value in art. "A lot," he said. "If you wanted to return the program to development, or more if you sold them individually to collectors or private teams." "How much is a lot?" He told her the number he'd calculated. He heard her exhale. "That's more than I paid to develop them," she said. "I know." He expected that to be the end of it. He thought she would take the information about Pruitt to her lawyers, take the engines back, and that would be the shape of the whole thing. A strange episode, a few months of interesting work in the cold garage, and then back to oil changes and import repairs. What he didn't expect was the letter that arrived in January. It was on Ashworth Dynamics letterhead, addressed to Drummond Automotive, and it was a formal offer. Not for the engines, those were still legally hers, but for a consulting contract, restoration and technical authentication of the M9 development program, at a rate he had to read twice because he thought he'd misread it the first time. There was a handwritten note at the bottom of the letter, not on company letterhead, just on plain white paper, clipped to the back. These machines needed someone to believe they weren't finished. I'm grateful that person was you. Beverly, he read it in the garage, standing by the bench where he'd turned over the first engine 3 months ago. The space heater ticked. Outside, a truck went by on Algonquin with its chains on, the sound of it clear and rhythmic in the winter air. He thought about Catherine, who had believed in things quietly and completely. He thought about Petra, who had watched him work every evening for 6 months and had never once asked him whether it was worth it. He thought about those 4 blocks on the flatbed, covered in a half-blown tarp, arriving on the wrong kind of day. He folded the letter and put it in the same pocket where he'd kept Beverly's first note, and he went inside to make dinner before Petra got home from school. The fourth engine came back from the machinist in Sault Ste. Marie in February. The fabricated part fitted perfectly, and when Callum ran it on the bench, it matched the performance specs of the other 3 units within a margin he would have been satisfied with on a factory floor. He called Beverly's office and left a message with a woman named Dale, who had the tone of someone who had been fielding important calls for 30 years and found most of them unimpressive. Beverly called back within an hour. "All 4, Callum said. Full specification. He heard something that might have been from a different person, a sound of relief. "Gideon Pruett," she said, "has agreed to a settlement. His lawyers called this morning. He won't be working in this industry again." Callum didn't say anything. "I wanted you to know," she said, "because you're the reason we had something to show them. Engines that worked, data that told the real story." "The engines told their own story," he said. "I just listened." A pause. Then, "Is that how you think about it?" "It's how I've always thought about engineering," he said. "Most things are trying to tell you what they are. You have to be quiet enough to hear it." Another pause, different from the first ones. Warmer, somehow. "I'd like to meet you," Beverly said, "when you're in the South or when I'm in the North. I think that's a conversation worth having in person." "I think so too," Callum said. Petra asked him, the evening after that call, whether the engines were gone now. "Going," he said. "Not yet gone." She thought about this. They were eating chicken soup, which was one of 4 things Callum could cook reliably, and she was picking the carrots out and eating them first, which she had done since she was old enough to use a spoon. "Are you going to miss them?" He considered the question seriously, the way she always expected her questions to be considered. "No," he said. "I don't think so. It wasn't about the engines." "What was it about?" He looked at her across the table. The kitchen was warm. Outside, it was February in Timmins, which meant the dark came early and stayed long, and the snow was banked up past the garage windows, and the world felt very small in the way that winter makes things feel small, which isn't always a bad feeling. "It was about remembering that I know how to do something," he said. "That's all." Petra ate a carrot. She gave this the same consideration she gave most things. "You know how to do a lot of things," she said. "Yeah," Callum said. "I'm working on remembering that." She went back to her soup. Somewhere outside, a car passed on the road, headlights sweeping briefly across the kitchen wall. It had arrived on the wrong kind of day, the flatbed had. The kind of gray November Wednesday, when you're half listening to a phone call and you don't quite feel like yourself, and the world has the flat quality of somewhere you're passing through rather than somewhere you live. But that was the thing about the wrong kind of day. Sometimes it was carrying exactly what you needed.